The phrase, the day of the Lord, is possibly the most commonly addressed end-time topic in the Bible, with nearly 36 total references. Considering most scholars agree that it's synonymous with the wrath of God, and that the rapture occurs just prior to this day, discovering its timing should also uncover the timing of the rapture. We have 4 aspects of the day of the Lord to discover. How many days of the Lord are there? How long is the day of the Lord? What happens on that day? And when does it take place in the chronology of end times? The phrase, the day of the Lord, refers primarily to a time period when God alone is exalted and the arrogance of man is ended. In this way, the day of the Lord is contrasted with the day we are currently living in, the day of man. It will be a time period when God vindicates himself and pours out wrath on Israel and the Gentile nations in punishment for their rejection of him. We call this the eschatological day of the Lord. In the Old Testament, other more minor periods of God's judgment on Israel were also occasionally called days of the Lord, so it is important to differentiate in the Old Testament passages which are being referred to. The initiation of the final eschatological day of the Lord is, of course, a single day. The phrase day of the Lord may also include a longer period of time. The pre-tribulation rapture theory considers the entire 7-year tribulation to be the day of the Lord, and some scholars consider the entire 1,000-year millennial kingdom to be the day of the Lord. Most of these are assumptions. Isaiah, however, contains 3 specific indications that the day of the Lord's wrath starts on a day and is also 1 year in length, such as Isaiah 34:8 and Isaiah 63:4. And also the famous passage, Isaiah 61:2, that was quoted by Jesus. From these 3 verses, we also find the principal purposes of the time of God's wrath. It is a time of recompense or punishment of the wicked. It is a time when Jesus will bring redemption to the unsaved of Israel. And it is a favorable year for Christians who will be raptured into the presence of God for that time. The day of the Lord encompasses all 3 of these purposes. The prophet Zephaniah summarizes other factors about the final eschatological day of the Lord as well. It is a day of wrath, distress, destruction, and darkness. Now, let's look at passages which indicate when the day of the Lord begins. In fact, let's build a timeline displaying all the precursors of the day of the Lord. In episode 5, we learned that the day of the Lord will not come unless the apostasy and revealing of Antichrist occurs first. This happens after the midpoint of the tribulation. This precursor eliminates the entire first half of the tribulation as a possibility for the beginning of the day of the Lord. So, let's move to a close-up view. Isaiah provides another clue to rapture timing. Only God is exalted on the day of the Lord. This precludes the Antichrist from being exalted in that day, and it precludes the day of the Lord and the Great Tribulation from being simultaneous. Obviously, the Antichrist is exalted during the Great Tribulation, so they can't happen at the same time. So let's add Isaiah 2 to our list of precursors after the end of the Great Tribulation. In episodes 2 and 3, we learned the day that the wrath of God begins happens after the time marker verse of Revelation 6:17. Notice it says, the great day. This is the day of the Lord. So we can add the time marker verse of Revelation 6:17 to our timeline. It marks the beginning of the day when the day of the Lord's wrath will finally be poured out. The time marker verse occurs right after the 6th seal, which is the darkening of the sun, moon, and stars. There are a number of verses that reference both the day of the Lord and this darkening. Isaiah 13 refers to the darkening of the sun, moon, and stars on the day of the Lord. Joel 3 tells us the day of the Lord is near when the sixth seal sign occurs. Notice it is near, it hasn't happened yet. And Joel 2 informs us that these six seal signs happen before the day of the Lord. Notice, it is the great day, just as our time marker verse tells us. So we can add the sixth seal and its sign of the darkening of the sun, moon, and stars. This is the event that cuts short the Great Tribulation as per Matthew 24:22, so that is where we are adding it on our timeline. Silence before the Lord in heaven is another sign that must take place before the day of the Lord's wrath. We find this reference in Zephaniah. The sacrifice the Lord has prepared is the fiery judgment he is about to pour out on the unrepentant. And who are his guests in heaven? Why, the raptured Christians, of course. When does this take place? There is only one time recorded in the Bible when praise stops in heaven. Amazingly, this happens upon the breaking of the seventh seal, further pinpointing the timing of the day of the Lord's wrath. So we will add silence before the Lord in heaven and the seventh seal, which take place after the rapture, yet before the Lord's wrath. In addition to this amazing timeline, which totally precludes the day of the Lord from occurring at the beginning of the tribulation, God has given us two more time markers for this time period. Elijah will return prior to the coming of the Lord's wrath. Many believe he may be one of the two witnesses, but because we are unsure of the timing of their ministry and Elijah's identity, let's not add this to the timeline. However, it seems to support our thesis as well. From Paul, we also see that the day of the Lord's wrath and destruction will come upon the unrepentant at the moment they are saying peace and safety. When is this? There are two possibilities. If you remember, we have shown that the Great Tribulation ends for the elect upon the sixth seal, and its signs of the darkening of the sun, moon, and stars. The unrepentant, unsaved Jews will have been persecuted severely up until this point. Perhaps it's at this point, when the persecution seems to have ended, that they will say, finally, peace and safety. And while they are saying this, Jesus appears in the sky, and then the wrath of God is poured out. It is also possible that the Gentile nations will say this a few days prior to the sixth seal being opened. If this is the moment the two witnesses are killed by the beast, then the great celebration that the world holds for this event may happen there. There are two possibilities, either right before or right after the sixth seal, but frankly, Paul doesn't give us quite enough information for us to place this precursor on our timeline. However, even without these last two precursors, the timeline is overwhelming evidence that the day of the Lord's wrath begins after the seventh seal. And this is highly problematic for pre-tribulationists. Paul had these additional things to say about the day of the Lord. He said Christians will be sustained until the day of the Lord, and that Jesus' blood will enable us to be found guiltless on that day. Paul also indicated that a man's spirit is saved upon the day of the Lord, again indicating the rapture happens on that day. As we indicated in bonus episode 9, it is a same-day rapture and wrath. So, what do pre-tribulationists have to say about these things? Initially, pre-tribulation rapture scholars like David Cooper, Walrood, and Hodges realized that Scripture clearly teaches the day of the Lord follows the rapture. They assumed the entire 7-year tribulation was the day of the Lord. However, when Marvin Rosenthal's pre-wrath rapture of the church was written in the early 1990s, it brought to light all these precursors which disproved this common pre-trib position. In response, pre-tribulationists began to say there were 2 days of the Lord, an intense or narrow one that started after the 6th seal, and a less intense one or broad one that started right after their supposed pre-tribulation rapture. Rather than admitting they may have been wrong about the timing of the rapture, they just made something up. Of course, that is not what the Scriptures teach. The term Day of the Lord is a specific technical term, as we've seen in all the examples in this video. There is one, and only one, eschatological day of the Lord's wrath that is coming, not 2. And God alone will be exalted on that day. All the time markers clearly point out that that time period begins after the 6th seal, and this eliminates the pre-tribulation rapture theory as a possibility.